This happened last spring when I was taking the train home from work, and it's one of those things that didn't seem like a big deal at first, but got more unsettling the more I thought about it afterward. I've taken public transportation for years, so I'm pretty used to random people and small, weird moments. But this one stuck with me because of how it slowly escalated. Nothing actually happened to me directly, but I'm pretty sure I was closer to being involved in something bad than I realized at the time. But anyways, I was 28 and working in an office downtown. I didn't feel like dealing with traffic every day, so I took the commuter train most mornings and evenings. It was a pretty standard routine, same station, same general schedule, and after a while you start recognizing people even if you never talk to them. There are always a few regulars who sit in the same spots or get on at the same stops. I usually kept to myself, put headphones in, and just tried to relax during the ride home. That day had been completely normal up until the train ride back. Nothing stressful, nothing out of the ordinary, which is probably why it took me a little longer than it should have to realize something wasn't right. The train I took had 2 levels, but I usually sat on the lower level near the middle because it was easier to get on and off quickly. The seating was arranged in pairs facing forward, with a narrow aisle down the center, and there was a door at each end of the car that connected to the next one. It was early evening, so the train wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. Most of the seats were filled, and a few people were standing near the doors. I found a seat by myself on one side and put my bag down next to me. Across the aisle from me, there was a guy sitting alone who looked a little older than me, maybe mid-30s. He had a backpack on the floor by his feet and kept glancing down at his phone. At first, there was nothing unusual about any of it. The train started moving, people settled in, and it was just the usual quiet ride. After a couple stops, a different guy got on and sat down directly across from me, facing my row. He looked around quickly before sitting, like he was checking who was already there, which I noticed but didn't really think much about at the time. What stood out more was that he didn't seem to relax after sitting down. He kept shifting slightly in his seat and glancing toward the guy with the backpack across the aisle, not constantly staring but checking on him over and over again. At first I assumed they knew each other and maybe had some kind of awkward interaction going on, but after a few minutes it became clear they weren't talking or acknowledging each other at all. The second guy just kept watching him. Eventually, the guy with the backpack noticed. He looked up from his phone, made brief eye contact with him, then looked away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the second guy leaned forward slightly and said something under his breath. I couldn't hear exactly what he said, but the tone was enough to make the situation feel different. The guy with the backpack responded quietly at first, like he didn't want to draw attention. The second guy said something again, a little louder this time, and at that point, I took one earbud out so I could hear better. The second guy was asking him about the bag, not in a casual way, but very direct, like he already thought something was wrong. He got overly protective and kept saying it was just his stuff and tried to brush it off, but the second guy didn't let it go. He pointed at the bag and asked why it was making noise. That caught my attention immediately. I hadn't noticed anything before that, but once he said it, I focused on the bag. There was a faint sound coming from it, not constant, but occasional, like something shifting or tapping lightly from inside. The guy with the backpack quickly moved his foot in front of it, like he was trying to block it from view. He said it was nothing, and told the other guy to mind his own business. At that point, a few other people nearby started paying attention too. The second guy stood up, not suddenly, but with enough intent that the mood in the car changed right away. He stepped into the aisle and pointed directly at the bag. Now he was speaking louder, asking what was inside and why it sounded like that. The guy with the backpack was noticeably frustrated and told him to sit down. They went back and forth for a few seconds, and you could feel the tension building in that small space. Then the bag moved. Not just a small sound this time, but an actual shift, like something inside pushed against it. At the next stop, the train slowed down and the doors opened. Before anything else could happen, the second guy moved toward the door and flagged down one of the transit staff who was standing on the platform. He started explaining the situation while pointing back into the train car. The staff member stepped inside and asked the guy with the backpack to come with him. At first, he hesitated, but with multiple people now watching, he eventually stood up and took the bag with him off the train. The doors closed a minute later, and the train kept moving. The whole car stayed quiet for a while after that. A couple stops later, someone near the front of the car mentioned they had seen what looked like air holes cut into the side of the bag when the guy picked it up. I didn't notice that myself, but it matched what I had seen with the movement. I never found out exactly what was inside, but the fact that it was moving on its own and the way the guy reacted when he was questioned about it made it clear it wasn't something he wanted anyone paying attention to. Since then, I still take the train, but I pay a lot more attention to the people around me than I used to. I've told this enough times that I don't really get worked up about it anymore, but it's still the first and only flight I've ever taken. I don't like flying to begin with, and I was already uneasy before anything even started, so I always try to make that clear when I explain what happened. It wasn't like something suddenly went wrong out of nowhere. I was already in a mindset where everything felt a little off, and I think that matters when I tell this story. I'm not someone who flies, unless there's no other option. I've always preferred driving, even if it takes a full day or longer, because at least I feel like I'm in control. Being in the air has never sat right with me, and I'm the kind of person who notices every change in engine noise or movement, which doesn't help. Even small things, like a shift in pitch or a slight drop, stick out to me more than they probably should. This trip wasn't optional, though. A close relative passed away, and the funeral was scheduled quickly, so there wasn't enough time to make the drive from Texas to Ohio without missing it. That kind of forced my hand. People kept telling me it would be straightforward, just a routine overnight flight, and that I'd probably sleep through most of it. That part didn't apply to me. I don't sleep on planes, not even a little. I stay aware of everything, even when I try to distract myself, and that usually just makes time move slower. I had already decided before boarding that I was just going to get through it, keep my head down, and not overthink anything unless something actually went wrong. The plane wasn't full, which I thought might make things easier, but it ended up making everything feel quieter and more noticeable. There's something about a half-full cabin that makes every little movement or sound stand out more than it would if it were crowded. I had a window seat on the right side, a few rows behind the wing, and there was one other person in my row, but they were across the aisle and fell asleep not long after takeoff. The cabin lights were dimmed early since it was an overnight flight, and most people settled in quickly. There wasn't much conversation, just the usual low background noise of the engines and occasional movement from people getting comfortable. From where I was sitting, I had a clear view of the wing, especially when there was lightning. Not long after we reached cruising altitude, we started going through a storm. It wasn't extreme at first, just steady turbulence that kept the seatbelt sign on and had the flight attendants seated. Over time, though, the movement became more consistent. Not violent, but enough that you couldn't ignore it. The plane would dip slightly or shift in a way that made it obvious we were moving through uneven air, and you could hear the wind hitting the outside differently. It had that hollow, rushing sound that changes when you're going through thicker clouds. After a while, the rhythm settled into something predictable, where every few minutes there would be a stronger movement, followed by a brief calm. Most people stayed quiet, and since it was dark, the only real light outside came from occasional lightning flashes that lit up the clouds and the wing for just a second at a time. Those flashes were the only moments where you could really see anything outside. The first time I noticed something that didn't sit right, it happened during one of those flashes. I was already looking out the window, watching the clouds and trying to stay occupied, when the light hit and I thought I saw something on the wing. It wasn't clear and didn't stay long enough to process fully, but it looked like a shape that didn't belong there. My first thought was that it had to be a reflection from inside the cabin, because that's the easiest explanation, especially at night. I leaned closer to the window and adjusted my angle, trying to recreate it. But for a while there was nothing unusual, just the wing, the rain, and the clouds moving past. Then another flash came, brighter than the last, and I saw it again in roughly the same spot. This time, it registered more clearly, and the closest thing I could compare it to was a person crouched or hunched over. That didn't make sense, so my brain immediately tried to turn it into something else, like ice forming unevenly, or a trick of light against the metal surface. I didn't say anything or react outwardly. I just sat back and tried to ignore it, because I didn't want to build something out of nothing, especially given how I already feel about flying. I remember telling myself that if I stopped looking for it, I probably wouldn't see it again. But the imagination wonders, and I found myself using my phone. I wanted something objective, instead of relying on quick flashes and my own interpretation. I opened the camera and pointed it toward the window, holding it steady against the glass, so I could catch the next few flashes and see what showed up. For a while, it didn't capture anything unusual. The wing looked exactly like it should, and the flashes just lit up the clouds and rain normally. I almost put the phone down, thinking that settled it, but I kept recording a little longer to be sure, mostly because I didn't trust my own first impression at that point. Then one of the flashes hit at a slightly different angle, and when I looked at the playback, there was definitely something there. It wasn't detailed enough to identify, but it was a darker shape positioned on the wing in a way that didn't line up with any part of the structure. What made it harder to dismiss was that when I scrubbed through the frames, the shape shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough that it didn't behave like a fixed reflection or static object. It looked like it had changed position between frames, even if only a little, and I could almost make out what looked like a face. I paused the video and held the phone still, trying to compare what I saw on the screen with what I knew had to be true. There isn't anything that can be on a wing mid-flight like that, especially not something that changes position. So I went through every normal explanation again: reflections, shadows from inside the cabin, distortions from the window, or even debris, even though none of them fit cleanly. I replayed the clip several times, and each time I noticed the same inconsistency in shape and position. It wasn't something I could easily categorize, and that's what stuck with me more than anything else. At that point, sitting there wasn't helping, and I could feel myself getting too focused on it. So I decided to go to the bathroom, mostly to reset and get away from the window. I waited for a moment when the turbulence eased slightly, then unbuckled and made my way down the aisle. The plane shifted a few times while I was walking, enough that I had to steady myself against the seats, which kept my attention on balance instead of what I had just seen. It wasn't unusual for a storm, but it added to the tension. Inside the bathroom, everything felt more contained, even though the movement was still noticeable. I turned on the light and stood there for a moment, looking at my reflection and trying to settle my thoughts. I told myself what I saw was probably lighting and perspective, and that the video just made it seem more convincing than it was. Then the turbulence picked up again, more sharply this time, and the plane dropped slightly in a way that made me instinctively grab the sides of the sink. When I looked back up at the mirror, for a fraction of a second, there was something behind me that hadn't been there before. It had that same face. It wasn't detailed and didn't stay long enough to study, but it was a distinct shape occupying space in the reflection where there shouldn't have been anything. It disappeared almost immediately, and my brain processed it after it was already gone. I turned around, expecting to confirm there was nothing there, and of course there wasn't. The space behind me was exactly what it should have been. I looked back at the mirror again, and it showed only me, with nothing I could point to as a distortion. I stayed there longer than I needed to, checking different angles and trying to recreate what I thought I saw. But nothing unusual happened again. Eventually, a flight attendant knocked and asked if everything was okay, which made me realize how long I had been in there. When I went back to my seat, I didn't open the window shade again for the rest of the flight. I kept it closed even when the lightning continued, because I didn't want to see anything else I couldn't explain. The turbulence gradually eased as we moved out of the storm, and the cabin stayed mostly quiet. We landed in Ohio without any issues. There were no announcements beyond the usual, and no indication that anything unusual had happened. After we got off the plane, I checked my phone again. The video was still there, and it still showed the same shape during that flash. I've shown it to a couple of people since then, and the responses have been what you'd expect. It looks like some kind of shadow or reflection, even if they can't say exactly what caused it. I still don't have a clear explanation for what I saw. The part on the wing could probably be explained as something visual, even if I haven't found the exact cause, but the reflection in the mirror is harder to place. I don't assume it was anything supernatural, because that doesn't really solve anything, but I also can't line it up neatly with stress or lighting in a way that feels complete. It's just something that happened in a very specific set of circumstances that I haven't been able to recreate or fully dismiss. I still avoid flying at all costs. It just feels easier not to test it again. I know some people might consider me paranoid, but I'll stick to driving for now. I've told this one enough times that people usually think I'm exaggerating parts of it, but I'm really not. If anything, I probably downplay it a little, because it sounds worse when you lay it all out. It happened when I was still in high school, just going home like I had done 100 times before, and it turned into something I didn't really process until I was already out of it. I was 16 at the time and going to school in the city. I took the subway every day, so I had no reason to assume I was in danger. My routine was always the same. I'd leave school, walk a few blocks to the station, get on, and ride a couple stops before switching lines. It wasn't a complicated route, and I had done it enough that I didn't really think about it anymore. I wasn't someone who got paranoid easily either. I knew to be aware of my surroundings, but I wasn't constantly on edge or anything like that. That day had been completely normal up until I left the school building. The walk from my school to the subway station went through a pretty busy part of the city. Shops, people walking around, traffic, all of it. It was still daylight, but getting closer to evening, so the crowd was starting to shift from students to people heading home from work. The station itself was underground, with a long staircase leading down to the platform. Usually, when I got there, there were already a decent number of people waiting. That's part of why I always felt fine taking that route. Even if something felt off outside, the station and the train were usually crowded enough that you blended in. I first noticed the guy while I was still walking toward the station. And in the beginning, he wasn't doing anything obvious at first, just walking behind me at a normal distance. The only reason I paid attention was because I had crossed the street, and a minute later I realized he had crossed too. I know that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I made eye contact with him, and he didn't make any of those uncomfortable reactions that people normally make when you catch them staring. I kept walking and didn't turn around again, but I was aware of him behind me in that way where you're tracking someone without looking directly at them. When I got to the subway entrance, I went down the stairs without hesitating. I figured once I got to the platform, it wouldn't matter. As I went down the stairs, I could hear footsteps behind me that matched my pace almost exactly. Not rushing, not lagging, just consistent. When I reached the bottom and stepped onto the platform, I moved off to the side and pretended to look at the map on the wall. That gave me a chance to look back at him. He didn't look at the map or hesitate. He just walked onto the platform and stopped a short distance away. Not right next to me, but close enough that it didn't feel random. I remember at that point, I thought I was being a little paranoid. I mean, people find themselves walking in the same direction all the time. And some people don't have the manners to know that staring is wrong. The train pulled in not long after that. I felt relieved because trains are usually crowded, and even if it was full of strangers, most criminals aren't bold enough to commit crimes in front of everyone like that. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, and my heart sunk almost immediately, because the cart was mostly empty. There was only one other person sitting near the far end, a guy with headphones on who definitely wasn't paying attention, and also probably wouldn't have cared what happened to me. I hesitated for a second, but the doors were already open, and I didn't want to stand there and make it obvious I was unsure. So I walked in and sat down as close as I could to the only other person there. A second later, the guy from the platform stepped into the same car. He didn't sit right next to me. He took a seat across the aisle, a couple rows back, close enough that I could feel his presence without having to turn around. At that point, the situation felt very real. I wasn't in a crowd anymore. It was just me, him, and one other person who wasn't paying attention. The train started moving, and I could feel my heart beating a lot faster than it should have. I didn't want to turn around and confirm anything, but I didn't really need to. At that moment, I was more than confident that whoever this man was, he didn't have any good intentions. I decided to get off earlier than I normally would. Not at my usual stop, just the next one. The second the train slowed down, I stood up and moved toward the door. I didn't look back, but I listened. When the doors opened, I stepped onto the platform and started walking quickly toward the exit. A second later, I heard footsteps behind me again. Same pace, same distance. The area outside that station was quieter than the one near my school. Fewer people, fewer shops, more closed storefronts. I kept walking, then turned a corner. I waited a minute just to be sure, then he turned the corner too. At that point, I didn't try to act normal anymore. I started moving faster. I ended up running. Not a full sprint at first, but fast enough that it was obvious I was trying to get away. I could hear him behind me, not gaining much ground, but definitely not falling back either. The street ahead of me was mostly empty, and I remember thinking how different it felt from just a few minutes earlier when I had been in a crowded area. Then I saw a food truck parked near the corner up ahead, with a couple of people standing there, and next to it was a police officer in uniform, holding a drink and talking to the vendor. I ran straight toward them and didn't slow down until I was basically right next to the officer. When I turned around, the guy who had been following me was already walking in the opposite direction. Not running, not rushing, just walking away like nothing had happened. I told the officer what happened, and he looked down the street, but by then the guy had already turned another corner, and they didn't find him. It's a big city. I haven't seen that man again, and as far as I know, he hasn't seen me either. I didn't really have an option at the time, so I kept taking the subway, until I finished school. Years have passed now, but every time I see some crazy story on the news about a crime on public transport of some kind, I just think about how it could have been me.